What's up guys, Reggie B Photo here, and in today's video I'm giving you 4 tips on getting better low light photos with your Fujifilm X-T3, and I'm going to show you guys how I edit high ISO Fuji RAW files in Lightroom. Welcome back, and for those of you who are new to the channel, my name is Reggie Ballesteros and I'm a wedding photographer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. As a follow-up to my previous video on sharpening Fuji RAW files in Lightroom, I wanted to show you guys how I edit high ISO Fuji files in Lightroom. But instead of just stopping there, I wanted to take it one step further and give you guys 4 tips on getting better low light photos with your Fujifilm camera. So let's jump right into it. Tip number 1, avoid shooting at high ISOs. So this one's pretty simple. Don't shoot at high ISOs if you don't have to. All cameras produce their best image quality at the base ISO, and the Fujifilm X-T3 is no exception to this. When faced with a low light situation, be sure that you've maxed out all your other settings before raising your ISO. If you have large aperture lenses, be sure to open up the aperture as much as you can, but do not sacrifice the sharpness and depth of field that you need to execute that photo, so be sure to keep the eyes in focus. And make sure to drop your shutter speed as low as you can as well, but be sure not to introduce unwanted camera shake or motion blur. For objects, landscapes, still life, product, you can usually shoot with a shutter speed of 1 over the focal length of your lens. And if you have a mini tripod handy, you can drop your shutter speed as low as possible in order to still be able to achieve that base ISO. For portraits or documenting people, you typically don't want to be shooting lower than 1 over 1/60th of a second. For little kids that are playing, running around, or animals, or if you're shooting sports, you typically want to be above a shutter speed of 1 over 250th of a second, or even faster, depending on what you're shooting. The moral of the story is raising your ISO should be a last resort. Tip number 2 is avoid underexposing at high ISOs. Alright, so you already open up the aperture as much as you can and you lower down your shutter speed to the slowest acceptable level, and you still have to raise your ISO. Well, make sure not to underexpose your subject at ISOs higher than 1600. While I love my Fujifilm X-T3, I'll be the first to admit that it cannot compete with the low light capabilities of its full frame competitors like the Nikon D850 or the Sony A7 III. For those camera systems, it's common practice to underexpose by 1 to 2 stops even when you get in the higher ISO ranges, just so that you can retain highlights and bring them back later in post. But the truth is, those cameras have larger sensors with larger pixels and better light gathering capabilities, and overall just less noise in the shadows even when you bring things back in post. The X-T3 on the other hand has a smaller crop sensor and just smaller pixels. This in turn leads to more noise in the shadows when bringing back up the exposure in post. So when you're shooting at the higher ISOs, 1600 and above, be sure to expose the image properly. That way you don't have to rely on bringing up back the exposure in post. And you don't have to introduce more noise into your image than is absolutely necessary. Tip number 3. Low light does not have to equal poor light. This tip is arguably the most important tip. And let me repeat myself. Low light does not have to equal poor light. Just because you're faced with a low light situation where you have to get into that high ISO range, that doesn't mean you have to settle for poor lighting conditions. Let me clarify this a little. You are the photographer, so take care in lighting your subject properly. Unless you're intentionally wanting to create a silhouette, generally you want your subject to be the brightest part of the frame. And in order to do that, they need to be lit from the front, the side, or any angle in between. Once the light's anywhere behind the subject, then most likely it's in shadow. And I already covered that there are more noise in the shadows of the image. Bringing up the shadows in post in the higher ISOs means introducing more noise to your image. So do your part and move the subject or move your camera's perspective to make sure that your subject is being front lit or side lit. And avoid backlighting unless you intentionally want it to be darker and a silhouette for the image. Truth is, no amount of editing can truly save a poorly lit photo. So do your part and think a little bit before you press that shutter, especially when you're at the higher ISOs. And my last tip number 4, use Fuji specific sharpening settings and apply noise reduction in post. If you make sure to follow these previous steps, after you take the photo and import it into Lightroom, next step is to apply Fuji specific sharpening settings and apply noise reduction appropriately. The final result produced is more than enough for professional client work. If you're new to using Lightroom or you're inexperienced experienced Lightroom user and new to the editing Fuji files, be sure to check out my previous video on how to sharpen Fujifilm RAW files in Lightroom. In that video, I deconstruct how Lightroom's sharpening algorithm works and what settings create the best results with Fujifilm RAW files, and avoid those warming artifacts that you hear many Fujifilm users complain about. From there, it's as simple as adding noise reduction in order to smooth out the noise in the background of the image. Alright, now let's jump into Lightroom and I'll show you guys how I apply sharpening settings and noise reductions by editing a few example photos. Alright, so I took a few photos of a controlled lighting situation in order to illustrate how the placement of the light and the placement of the subject affects the overall image, especially when at high ISOs. And then I've got two other situations in actual, natural light to show you that the relationship of the subject and its position in relation to the light really does affect how sharp the photo actually comes out in the end once you reduce the noise. And the last example photo that I have here is inside a dimly lit restaurant to show you guys that you can get some pretty good results. Let's dive into these and see what we get. So this first photo right here, we can see that it's backlit by this LED panel, and here the second photo is front lit right here. So between these two we can see what the lighting situation, how different it is. So we're going to dive into this one, and I'm going to drop in my preset, which applies my default curves adjustments and kind of color tones. Here we're going to bump up the exposure just a little bit, and then in order to kind of make this look better, we have to raise the shadows or the exposure. So I'm just going to do that here just to see what we can get. Bring that down a little bit. I'm not going to expose it too high. Add a little bit of contrast back in here, some clarity, and then, it's not really looking pretty, but you get the idea. It's going to illustrate itself later. I'm not going to try to and then we're going to go into here, and if you've already watched my previous video, you'll know where these starting settings came out from. And usually for masking at a high ISO image, you're going to want to be around 90 to start, and then you're going to move over to the background right here and take a look at the background and increase the noise until it's fairly smooth without really reducing the sharpness of the subject. So here, it's to taste, but I prefer 40 instead of 45, and you can see that the subject is still fairly sharp, but this is at ISO 12,800, so it's not going to be as sharp as we can. I'm going to bring this up just a tad. This is kind of what our final result is. So we're going to jump into this other lighting situation. Already it looks a lot better. So let's drop in that colors and tones real quick. And then here you don't even have to change very much. Realize that my lighting situation might be affecting. Alright, so then we'll go in here and kind of apply some masking here. Background. Just smooth this out till it's smooth enough to where I want it. And this one here, she didn't need as much as the other one, even though it was the same ISO. I didn't need as much, and sometimes you'll have to go back and forth between the noise and the masking just to make sure that you're really covering all those in the background. So here I'm going back to 90 again, and then this one looks a lot better at high ISO. So if we compare these two and we zoom in, by changing the light there's a lot less noise and a lot more clarity in the image on the subject. So, and the noise in itself in the background is fairly close. It's not that much different. The only difference is that these we had to bring up the shadows a little bit more, so you can see more of the noise pronounced. But hopefully that illustrates to you that simple placement of the lighting in relation to the subject is going to have a big impact in how clean your photo can be at 12,800 ISO. So for this next one is a natural light situation. Here I'm going to drop my colors and tones in the beginning, and then I'm going to fix that white balance just because it's kind of off for me. Like 88. Put a little bit more warmth. Alright, so this is a little bit better. And what I'm going to do is I kind of calm the highlights down just a tad, even though it's blown out. Maybe put up the shadows a little bit. So right here, and then we're going to need a lot of contrast to kind of get this a bit more punch back in. And then probably some clarity. And bumped exposure just a touch. Here this is, you know, kind of where it does. The highlights are still a little hot for me, but I want to make sure to expose the subject properly. So we're going to go in here and adjust the masking to try to get the noise out of the background. And that's fairly good. And then so now we're going to increase the noise reduction. Like 35. It's gonna do it for me here, and you can see that I had to, in order to calm down these background noise, I had to take a big hit on the sharpness and clarity of the overall subject. It's not the best. And here you can already see from this front light situation, the lighting is a lot better and the sharpness is a lot better. So I'm going to drop in my color tones and adjust the exposure just a little bit and add a little bit of detail back into the shadows. But you know, there really isn't too much needed to bring back the subject at this point. We're just calming down the highlights and just making sure that we're getting our tones dialed in, but we don't have to bring up the subject or help it out too much because it was already the brightest part of the frame to begin with. So here I'm going to add a little bit of contrast and clarity and fine-tune the exposure, but we can already see that details in the eyes and the nose are a lot more clear and crisp than the previous image. So now we can add in our masking from the sharpening settings, and could probably even go a little bit more than the other photo just because there's a lot more detail that's recognized by the mask. And here we're going to add some noise reduction, just fine tune that a little bit. And here you just kind of iterate between noise reduction and masking just to fine tune that the details are there where you want it. You're not getting it too soft, but your background is still nice and smooth. Alright, so if we compare these two images, the results are pretty drastic, especially considering they're both at the same high ISO value, but there's a lot more clarity in the subject, you know, in the nose, the eyes, and the background themselves it's fairly the same. So, you know, I've got some green here, but it's not super distracting. But, you know, you get the idea of how the two different lighting conditions can change the noise characteristics of the image. For here, I'm only at ISO 6400, but you know, the photo is pretty dimly lit, and the subject just is lit by there's a window, a kitchen over here with some bright lights, and then she's also got her phone illuminating her face. So I'm gonna drop in my color tones right here in the beginning, and counterintuitive to saving the highlights, I'm gonna actually push the highlights back up a little bit just to kind of like keep that contrast. And I'm gonna put the photo up a tad and a little bit more. Touch up contrast here. Here I might actually make the photo a little bit like a stop. Let's see. Then boost shadows as a tad. A little bit of contrast and then some clarity. Just drop it back down. You're gonna fix the white balance just a little bit. And then that's too much. Alright, and then so I'm gonna actually drop in a gradient filter, add a little bit more focus to the subject. So I've got -32 on the exposure, or -0.32. And if you kind of want to preview what that effect is, it just kind of gives you a little bit more focus on the subject without creating like a circular, predictable circular vignette. Something I do on a lot of my photos. Let's fix this crop a little bit. Kind of strain for this right here. Oops, too much. Probably this line right here actually. Boom. And then what we're gonna do is go into the ISO right here, or the sharpening. Bring up that mask to like right here. This is 88. Bring it. So here, obviously, I missed focus a little bit, but just to kind of illustrate that this is still going to be pretty usable result. Got my ISO, or sorry, I've got my noise reduction at 35. Like 33, and while these previews look a little soft, when you do the final export and have the export sharpening, I'll go over my output sharpening here. So in my preset for exporting to this video edit, I have this 4K Premiere, and I've got output sharpening. So output sharpening is pretty important, and here I have it to sharpen for screen and standard. So. And then I'll show you guys the final image result here. Hopefully these results and these edits were helpful, and it can show you the drastic difference between properly lighting your subject. You know, in this pair of photos and this pair of photos, it's pretty obvious. And then as far as this photo goes at ISO 6400, hopefully I can show you that you can actually get some usable results in real world situations, not controlled situations, not with a lot of light. Alright, that wraps it up for this Lightroom session. If this video helped you out, hit that like button. And if you have any questions about shooting in low light or the high ISO editing settings that I use, let me know down in the comments below. Also, if you have any tips about shooting in low light that I did not cover, please share them in the comments down below. And if you're new, please subscribe for new videos every other Monday. And if you want to see more of my work, head over to Instagram and follow me at ReggieBPhoto. Alright, that's it for me. Make sure to get out, go shoot, and I'll see you guys in the next one.